Welcome to Mysteries to Die For and this toe tag. I am TG Wolff and I'm here with Jack, my piano player and producer. This is normally a podcast where we combine storytelling with original music to put you at the heart of a mystery. Today is a bonus episode that we call a toe tag. It's the first chapter from a fresh release in the mystery, crime, or thriller genre. Today's featured release is Rise to Rebellion by Julie Bates. Okay, I know I said that, we typically do the first chapter, but today we're going to do the third. And the reason is this story is really I call it a braid, a weave of three different storytelling styles. There is mystery, there is women's fiction, and then there is historical fiction. So chapter 1 is really scene setting in the historical sense. Chapter 2 is a story told by Faith Clark, one of the lead narrators, and that's the women's fiction line. And so we're going to start with chapter 3, which is Jeremy Butler's line, and this is where we find our mystery, which is what we're about here at Mysteries to Die For. So let's begin with chapter 3. Jeremy Butler approached the tavern from the busy street. The tall brick building stood solidly in the afternoon sun. His eyes watered in the glare. The scent of roasting meat, along with the rich yeastiness of fresh baked bread, drifted through the open windows, making his mouth water. He had enjoyed the coffee and cakes at Faith's sister's home, but his stomach longed for something solid. Hopefully, this meeting with Washington would include a meal. That's George Washington. He followed a group of well-dressed men up the steps and through an elegantly columned door into a main hall. Passing by the subscription room where the tavern keeper kept newspapers and pamphlets for his guests, Butler headed straight for the bar. A toffee-haired man stood behind the counter, wiping down its dark wooden surface. He glanced up at Butler as he approached. "Can I help you, sir?" Butler smiled. "I'm here to meet an associate. Perhaps you've heard of him? Cincinnatus?" The bartender's expression did not change. "I can't say as I have. Let me check with my master and see if he can help you." He turned and called to an African-American man who was feeding the fire. "Lawrence, can you mind the bar for a moment?" Lawrence rose and dusted his hands on the cloth apron around his waist. As the two passed, the first man's eyes flickered at Butler, then back. The other man nodded. "Can I offer you a drink, sir?" Lawrence's voice was soft and lightly tinged with the cadence of the West Indies. His dark curls were pulled back into a tidy club fastened with a leather strap. A few curls escaped and hovered over his temples. Butler accepted a stein of local beer and took pleasure in slaking his thirst. The beer was cold from the cellar and welcome after the warmth outside. He had only gotten a few swallows down before the original man returned. "Follow me, sir. They're waiting for you," he said. Butler took his tankard and followed him past the coffee room and up the main staircase. At the top, he was surprised to enter an enormous room filled with long tables. Had the tables been removed, one could have held a ball there. Sunlight streamed through the elegantly draped windows. "This way," the man said, waiting for Butler to follow. He led him into a smaller adjoining room where three men sat around a table, none of whom was George Washington. After Butler entered, the barman left, shutting the heavy wooden door behind him. The men looked up from the table as he entered. He recognized Samuel Adams immediately. His strong face, with its massive black brows, offered a fierce stare before beckoning him to come closer. "Jeremy Butler," he bellowed as he rose from the head of the heavy wooden table. "Come sit with us and apprise us of how the rebellion fares in the Virginia colony. Jefferson tells me nothing. I need the views of an honest man who will not pretty things up to suit his own purposes." Not much had changed since the days Butler had reported to him and the Sons of Liberty in Boston. Once Washington had been named commander-in-chief, Adams had sent him to the Virginian, who paid him to be a trusted messenger and a spy for the patriot cause. Butler nodded in greeting as he approached the table. The other two men had risen as well. Once his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light in the wood-paneled room, he recognized them as well, although he had not met them formally. He raised a brow in query at Adams before taking an available seat at the far end of the table. As the others sat back down, a maidservant entered and placed goblets of wine all around. Butler was more than happy to accept another drink. It was a warm day, and his throat was dry. Please bring a plate from my friend as well, Molly, Adams said, indicating Butler. She smiled and nodded at Adams, revealing a small gap in her pearly white teeth. A buxom woman of about 30, she appeared comfortable at her job. Her lightly muscled arms handled the heavy tray of drinks with ease as she served the men before leaving in short order. Adams gestured toward the others. Allow me to introduce my companions. This is John Hancock, President of our Congress, and this, his voice lowered in respect, is Benjamin Franklin. Jeremy had heard of both men. Hancock had the shrewd face and dark, intelligent eyes of a successful businessman. Butler knew he was one of the most wealthy and influential men in the colonies. The other man was much older, but had a well-known reputation as well. Benjamin Franklin was famous for his writings, his scientific experiments, and now for his support of the revolt against Great Britain. One would have thought the elderly man almost napping, but Jeremy knew his reputation. That guileless face masked a clever brain, one well-skilled at sending well-aimed arrows through the printed word. He glanced around, puzzled. There was no empty chairs, so it appeared no one else was expected. Where is General Washington? He asked at last. Hancock spoke. His cultured voice revealed the quality of his education, as did his elegant clothes. Ah, yes. Regretfully, our good friend Cincinnatus has important business in New York with the Army. He was kind enough to write a letter summoning you to us. He understood that you would be more likely to respond to a request from him rather than from me. Molly arrived with food at that moment, setting out platters of well-roasted beef and potatoes paired with carrots and green beans. Butler inhaled the air perfumed with food as he looked down at his plate. I'll be back with bread and more drink, she said, as her skirt swished around the door, closing swiftly behind her. Gentlemen, let's eat before we discuss business. Master Franklin, will you offer a blessing over our repast? Franklin nodded and, bowing his head, offered a brief blessing to the Almighty. After the echoed amen, he added, Let us make quick work of this generous repast before it goes cold, gentlemen. In the days ahead, we may not feast this richly for some time. Adams responded, Do you fear the British will blockade the entirety of the colonies? Oh, I believe the British will use all means at their disposal to bring us to heel, Franklin said, before bringing a generous fork of potato to his mouth. He followed with a sip of wine. Once he brushed his lips with a napkin, he noted, Wine is proof that God loves us. Butler joined in the meal, eating and drinking carefully. A heavy meal made him sluggish, and he needed his wits about him. He pondered the company who had summoned him. Hancock and Franklin were strangers, although he was acquainted with Franklin's writing. Hancock he regarded with suspicion. Although he knew him to be a dedicated patriot, he also recognized him as wealthy and ambitious. Butler recalled he'd had to flee the British when they took Boston last year, although he looked none the worse for wear. He wore an elegant blue coat with gold facing, while the lacy white jabot cascaded down his throat. Butler soon realized that Hancock's eyes were assessing him as well. How was your journey up from Virginia, Master Butler? Hancock asked. Less than satisfactory, Butler said. My coach encountered a British patrol led by a man called Tarleton. Hancock winced. I've heard of him. I take it that's how you acquired your injury? Butler nodded and then addressed the man. Why have I been summoned here? Hancock smiled. Washington said you were direct. He also said you were the best man for the job. He quit toying with his goblet and nailed Butler with a direct stare. There is a threat to our delegation. We need to find who it is and prevent him from causing any more mischief. Butler leaned forward. What kind of threat? Keep your voice down, man, Hancock hissed. Do you want to incite panic? He looked at the men around the room. Nothing leaves this room. He looked pointedly at Adams, who flushed. I know when to keep my mouth shut. I've played this game far longer than you. He scowled as he took another draw of his wine. Adams pulled at his collar as if it bothered him, but he refrained from further comments. Franklin said, Then it's best we say what needs to be said and adjourn before someone takes notice of our presence. Even our fair city, there are those who would share information with the enemy. Hancock nodded. So noted. There have been a handful of disturbing incidents that taken together, cannot be ignored. 3 weeks ago, Thomas Fitzsimmons' valet took ill with what was thought to be a summer ague. He died a few days later and was buried. Then we received this. He took out a folded piece of paper. On it was written in a neat copper plate, "Who dies next?" Butler took it and examined it thoughtfully. Nothing special about the paper. You can buy it at any print shop. He sniffed the sheet. "It smells like your toilet water." Hancock looked faintly embarrassed. "Now, see here." Butler quelled him with a glance. "If you expect me to unravel this puzzle, you need to take care and not contaminate any clues." He kept looking. "I can't see anything special about the ink, but there was someone here who knows ink better than me." He looked over at Franklin. "What do you see?" Franklin took the note from Butler and adjusted his glasses. "As you said, this is basic laid paper. My shop sells it, but so do many others. But it takes a certain amount of income to afford to send a letter, so whoever is behind it has money. I also believe this is gall ink, also widely used. I agree with Master Butler's nose. The scents of ambergris and vanilla are pronounced. You might consider using less." He set down the note. "Nonetheless, Master Butler, it is a threat, and not an idle one." "What else has happened?" Butler waited for one of the men to answer. Adams obliged. "The first week we met as a delegation, the chandelier in our meeting room at the State House broke free and fell to the floor. Fortunately, we had taken a break and no one was underneath it. When a smith came to repair it, the chain was found to be almost sawn through so that the weight eventually might break it loose. Then there was the incident with Rutledge's carriage." "Rutledge?" Butler asked. Hancock answered. "One of the South Carolina delegates. He rented a carriage to take him about the city. He had offered Franklin and Jefferson a ride back from one of our local taverns to the State House when something spooked the horses. Luckily, the driver knew his business and brought them to heel before they ended up in the river." "What else?" Butler asked. "Well, last night," Hancock continued, "someone threw a large rock and shattered a window at the State House. Some of our men were cut by the glass, but no serious injuries." Butler leaned back in his chair. "Do you have any suspects?" Adams chuckled humorlessly. "This town is full of Tories. It could be any of them. I have no doubt they have their spies throughout the town." Butler took a drink of wine. It was far better vintage than he could afford. He sipped slowly, enjoying the feel of it on his tongue. The horses could have been an accident. "The chandelier was not," Hancock said grimly. "I had the meeting room inspected before the delegates arrived, and that chain was sound. Someone meant to do us harm." Franklin interrupted. "Perhaps, or someone had a grudge against an individual. Ever since Peyton Randolph's unfortunate demise last summer, we've all been more aware of our own mortality." He nodded at Hancock. "Perhaps such caution is not without cause. You employ someone to check the food since your last dinner party." Hancock nodded as he fidgeted with the ruffled cuffs that extended past his jacket sleeves. "I had a half a dozen guests take ill after a dinner party earlier this week. All have recovered, but no one was discovered why those only took ill. We all ate the same meal, served by the staff I have employed for some time." "Can you provide me with a list of guests?" Butler asked. "Both those who fell ill and those who did not?" Hancock nodded. "Try not to offend anyone. I do business with many of these people." Butler's tone was dry. "I imagine they would have a vested interest in discovering who would want to harm them." Adams snorted. "It's far more likely they will blame him, assuming he was the intended victim. I was up half the night filling the chamber pot, unlike my companions here." Hancock nodded. "I had a bad headache that night, so I ate very little past the first course." "It would appear your moderation kept you from harm," noted Franklin. Light from the windows cast a silvery glow over his spectacles, hiding his eyes. Bushy gray brows rose over the frames, rising and falling with his expression. Butler mulled over what the men had said. He was pretty certain there were things they were not telling him as well. They watched him, waiting for what he would say next. But then the past few years had taught them all to be careful around strangers and wary of friends. No one really knew a man's loyalties until they were tested, and as often as not, a friend could turn when what he valued at most was put at risk. Butler didn't blame them for being frightened. Only a fool would not. He was grateful for Washington's trust. "I need to talk with the people regarding each incident," Butler said at last. "There are no guarantees, and I cannot guard all delegates. There are too many of them." "You don't need to," Hancock said. "Only a few were present at all 4 incidents." "Who is there besides you 3?" Butler asked bluntly. Adams answered. "Hancock's servant, Gaius." Butler leveled a look at Hancock. "Why isn't he here?" Hancock met Butler's gaze firmly. "Because he has duties at home. I've known Gaius since he was a boy. He would no more harm me than he would attempt to fly off a rooftop. He is not part of this. I would stake my reputation on this." "But would you stake your life on it?" Butler stared back at Hancock, letting the silence deepen before continuing. "Some of the British have offered freedom to the enslaved. That would be an incredible temptation to a man bound for life. I need to talk to him so I can hear directly from him what he saw." Hancock nodded. "I will make him available to you. He can accompany me to the State House tomorrow instead of Cato." Butler looked at the men gathered at the table. Tiredness and anxiety hung over them. Like all of the representatives gathered for the Congress, they knew the meetings like this labeled them as traitors to the British. Their lives could well be forfeited for their choices, and their families marked. He had nothing but respect for the risks they took. The choices he made in secret, they did in open defiance. A tinkling of utensils on plates ceased as the meal concluded. A lone maidservant cleared away the plates while one of the tavern's freedmen came up with a bottle of wine, showing it to Hancock, who inspected it before nodding his approval. A fine Madeira. He allowed the glass to be filled with a deep red wine. Adams partook as well. Franklin covered his glass with a polite refusal. Butler did likewise. "I'm afraid I lost my taste for Madeira," he said, remembering how it had been used to poison a friend last year, "and I need to keep a clear head anyway." "As we all do," Franklin agreed. The main poured a clear liquid, which Butler realized, to his surprise, was water. The old man downed it before he rose. "Forgive me, I have some other business to attend before it gets much later." "As do I," Butler said, who wanted a few moments alone with him. "May I walk out with you?" Franklin did not object, so Butler followed him to the door, feeling Hancock's eyes boring into the back of his head as he exited. Despite his age, Franklin moved nimbly down the steps to the door. "Put my meal on account," he said to the man at the bar, who nodded in acquiescence. Butler told him, "You can put mine on Hancock's tab." Out in the street, the summer sun beat down, reflected by the cobblestones that lined the street. Franklin turned and headed down Chestnut Street downtown. The wooden heels of his shoes made a solid clop as he walked. The traffic had died down with the rising heat of the afternoon. Butler squinted as he cast his gaze about before falling in step with Franklin. "Sally will be wondering where I am," Franklin noted wryly. "She worries unnecessarily about her dear papa." He continued east toward the Delaware River. Gulls circled overhead, diving to snatch a meal from unwary carts before wheeling up with raucous cries. Franklin watched them with a slight smile. Such efficient creatures. They find a meal where most would see waste. Butler skirted around the spilled box that excited the birds. The scent of fish was nauseating, although it did not seem to impact his companion. He knew little of Franklin. He had been fascinated by accounts of his experiments, even if he considered playing with lightning slightly insane. "What do you make of these incidents?" Butler asked as they walked down the street. Franklin paused before crossing an alley. "Individually, they could be accidental. But, taken together," his eyes met Butler's, shedding the guise of a genial old man. "Together, they indicate someone wants to end the revolution before it begins." All right, so there you have Chapter 3 of Rise to Rebellion by Julie Bates. And so here's my review. Rise to Rebellion is classified as a historical mystery. July 1776, Jeremy Butler is called to investigate threats to the Continental Congress delegation. The attacks seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and no one within households are safe. Jeremy finds an unlikely ally in Hannah White, a Quaker, a widow, and a businesswoman. Together, they unknowingly corner the villain, only to have to fight their way out. The bottom line is Rise to Rebellion is for you if you're like mysteries equally braided with historical and women's fiction. All right, so let's talk about the strength of the stories. The premise is definitely one of the shining stars. Set in July of 1776, the war for independence is palpable to all. Everyone has a side, and being on the side of the Patriots isn't the easy decision that history leads us to believe. Bates shows us the working class side of Philadelphia through the household of Hannah Payne White and the farm where Faith Payne Clark has returned to. The storytelling of the life of unmarried women, freed persons, and enslaved person humanizes the history, showing us strong, capable people doing what they can to not just survive, but to live and to thrive. And Bates certainly did her research in history and the culture of the era. It too is a shining star. A note from the author talked about her commitment to historical accuracy and the one liberty she took with the story to make it doable for Jeremy. She apologized to history buffs who may be confused by the change. As someone who personally calls out unreasonable time frames, I appreciate that she noted that it was unreasonable and took steps to make the story plausible. So Jeremy Butler's story, his is the mystery. As described, he's gone to Philadelphia to investigate incidents affecting members of the Continental Congress. John Hancock and Ben Franklin believe someone is working to subvert their cause. Faith Clark's story is women's fiction. Faith returns home to visit her dying mother, reuniting with the father and the siblings that she left behind when she married and moved to Virginia. There is some intrigue. There's the discovery of a murdered neighbor and an unknown oldest sister, but the story arc is focused on Faith coming to terms with her upbringing and her mother. Now, Hannah Clark's story, who is Faith's sister, is a mix of drama, romance, and mystery. She picks up with the question of the unknown sister and follows the leads down as she's juggling running her own business selling china and taking care of her guest, Jeremy Butler, who returns far too often bleeding from one place or another. All three characters are engaging and likable, and I'm sure readers will vary on which character and which storyline was their favorite. This is the third book in the Faith Clark mystery series. I've not read the first two, but this story does stand alone. It is set a year after the second and is in a different location. All right, so where did the story fall short of an ideal mystery? There are a few places where Rise to Rebellion falls short of an ideal historical mystery. While this is part of the Faith Clark mystery series, Faith's storyline is women's fiction and is only present for about half the book. At that point, her sister Hannah picks up the storytelling, taking it in a different direction. The mystery would be more accurately characterized, as a Jeremy Butler mystery. The story alternates chapters between Jeremy and then Faith and Hannah. So readers who like multifaceted stories will enjoy the mystery, the historical, and the women's fiction weave of the story. Standing at the end of the mystery and looking back, as you all know I like to do, well, I had questions with this one. Actions in the middle and end of the story are definitely supported by the resolution. It's more the beginning of the story that gives me pause as I'm, again, with the benefit of hindsight. The story of Faith making peace with her mother is solid, and the story of the unknown oldest sister again raises questions that the resolution didn't fully explain. I read the Kindle ebook version, and this version did have typesetting errors throughout. Some readers will find the errors distracting or potentially confusing, but if you're one of those who doesn't notice, a comma fault or something, then you may not notice this at all. All in all, this was a pretty enjoyable story. I would say that if you are a real traditional mystery lover, like, Joe Friday, Just the Facts Ma'am, that this might not be for you. But if you like rich storytelling with engaging characters that really wrap into their lives, then you should give this one a try. The Rise to Rebellion was released from Level Best Books and is promoted by Partners in Crime Tours and is available from Amazon and other book retailers. The link is in the show notes. So let's learn a little bit about today's author, Julie Bates. After spending a few years writing freelance articles, Julie's first novel, Cry of the Innocent, premiered in June 2021. The series follows the timeline of the American Revolutionary War. She is a member of Sisters in Crimes, Triangle Sisters in Crimes, Mystery Writers of America, Southeastern Mystery Writers of America, and the Historical Novel Society. When not busy plotting her next story, she enjoys working in her garden, doing crafts, and spending time with her husband and son, as well as a number of dogs and cats who have shown up on her doorstep and never left. Partners in Crime Tours represents a network of 300-plus bloggers offering tailor-made virtual book tours and marketing options for crime, mystery, and thriller writers. Founded in 2011, PICT offers tour services for well-established and best-selling authors, as well as those just starting out their careers. PICT prides itself on its tailored packages for authors with a personal touch from the tour coordinators. For more information, check out their website, partnersincrimetours.com, links in the show notes. And with that, we will wrap it up. Join us next week for Season 7, Games People Play, Episode 10, Hunting for Clues by Nick Andrachik, where a scavenger hunt is the featured game. All right, Jack, with that, take us out.